From Studio A at the USC Annenberg School, this is Wade Boohar, your host for the Paradigm Podcast. Please welcome our guest, Dr. Jazlyn Mooney. Dr. Mooney is Gabilan Assistant Professor of Quantitative and Computational Biology and has been here at USC since fall of 21, right?
I think 22.
22, okay. But thank you for being here. To start off, can you tell us just a little bit about your background and how you got into your current position in population genetics?
Yeah, so I guess the place to start is actually in middle school. So in middle school, I had this really great science teacher where, first of all, he named his kid after a butterfly. So that should tell you how into biology he was. But the big goal of our class was literally just going out, catching bugs and lizards, and then labeling them and like the series of like taxonomic names that they have and drawing them. So I knew that I really liked biology. So when I started in college, I was like, you know what? I like biology, so I'm going to be a bio major. And then along the way, I got introduced to anthropology. And that's when I realized like, oh, I could actually learn about like human evolution. And specifically, the person who was teaching me anthropology was a population geneticist. And then I also realized during that time where I was trying different things out and trying to do research, like I was really bad at wet lab, just terrible at wet lab research. So I realized I need to be on a computer. And so that's what really got me started in population genetics, was a really great professor who introduced me to population genetics through the framework of learning about human evolution through time. And then that professor like stayed on with me. He like had me join his lab as an undergrad. So that's when I really learned how to program. And then he said, you know, maybe you should consider going to grad school. And here's 5 people that you should consider going to grad school with. So I feel like my friends and I always have a running joke, like who conned you into doing research in their lab? And that's basically what happened is like, he was like, you should think about doing this. You're pretty good at it. And then he was like, you know what? You should consider a PhD. And I knew I liked to learn. So that was really what got me into the field, was liking to learn and knowing that I wanted to learn about science.
I see. And you got your PhD at where again?
Oh, UCLA, right down the road. Yeah, you know what? I think, though, that I will say I don't own any UCLA gear.
Okay.
And I do own USC gear, so...
Well, you're at the better place now, obviously. And then for our listeners who might not be super familiar with what population genetics is, do you have like a good kind of like maybe overview of the field, or what should listeners think of when they hear that word?
So for me, when you think about population genetics, what you really want to think about is, in my perspective, we're basically studying the genetic composition of a population. And we're thinking about like, how does that, genetic diversity that's in a population, it might influence a genotype, meaning the actual ATCG that we're seeing. It might also introduce influence a phenotype, meaning like a physical thing that manifests. But we want to know basically like, how does that genetic composition in a population change through time due to maybe the population changing sizes, or maybe some migration between groups is occurring. And also maybe it's influenced by selection. Like, let's say a group moves to a new environment and needs to change. So that's basically what we're studying, is like, how does genetic composition change through time and space due to like all the factors that might influence a population.
That's very interesting. And I hear that you teach a population genetics class and an ethics class?
Yeah. So I'm fortunate enough to teach a population genetics class called Statistical and Evolutionary Genetics with Doc Edge, who's an amazing teacher. So if you're into like learning from someone who loves to teach, you should come take our class. And that class is a capstone class for our Q Bio majors. There's so many great students like you who've gone through it. And in studying population genetics, and I guess this is topics that we'll get into next, like I realized a lot of population genetics is not what I thought it was. And the foundations are quite murky. And so that's what prompted me to get into ethics, is like, I'm really big into thinking like, we're doing all this research. Many of us and many of our students want to make sure that when we do research, we're advancing humanity or whatever we're interested in advancing. Maybe it's conservation or something like this. But we have to think about our field and like what happened in the history of the science, and like how can we move forward and do better. So that's why I teach this class. It's ethics. It's technically ethics, and I think you want it, biology, medicine, and statistics, because we touch on all of these topics in the class. But it's basically giving you like a view through science, like of the science history and how that influences everything that we do today.
I see. You kind of brought it up, but the past with population genetics, I know it has a pretty complex history, and that history is directly tied to racism.
Yeah.
How has kind of population genetics been used to justify racism in the past?
Yeah, so that's pretty deep. So
Jump right in.
yeah, I will say so. If there are viewers who are really interested in it, there's much better synopses out there than what I'll give the broad overview of. But basically, the roots of population genetics are in eugenics, and so eugenics is a word that showed up around, I would say, like 1883. A man named Francis Galton, who's Charles Darwin's cousin, coined the word. And he coined it when he was writing this book. The book has a long name that I wrote down so I won't mess it up. But the idea is basically, the book is called Inquiries into Human Fertility and Its Development. So his whole argument was that a lot of social traits, like your status, how much money you have, intelligence, beauty, were heritable, like genetically heritable. And now we know that's absolutely not the case. This is all due to socioeconomic status and the environment. So basically, eugenics is supposed to mean, it derives from a Greek word that's supposed to mean like good stock. And Galton's idea was basically that we could selectively breed people to improve human stock. And so this is the idea that he's propagating in this book, and he continues to propagate as he's doing science. So this guy was basically the foundation of a lot of population genetics. He and Darwin, who read his book and also endorsed it, went on to fund people like Carl Pearson. So if you're into math and you've done a Pearson correlation coefficient, that guy's a eugenicist. Ronald Fisher, who's one of the founders.
Test.
Fisher's exact test. So that's why it's ethics in biology, medicine, and statistics. Fisher's exact test. Big eugenicist. This man actually has like on the record correspondence with like well-known Nazi scientists in the Third Reich. And these are people who established our field. So when you think about it in the context of the times, which is like colonialism, it kind of makes sense. There were certainly people who were advocating that we should not be doing this, and this is not the case. But at the time, somehow, eugenics got tied into population genetics because of the foundation. So the tie to race is like maybe moving into your next set of questions and like what's actually happening in our field and how racism gets kind of caught up in all of this is basically that before Galton had written this book, taxonomic systems exist. So a guy like Linnaeus, who maybe you heard of in your biology classes, like he made taxonomic systems. And I think that, I'm not a social scientist, but as a human being, we love to categorize stuff. Like we love to put things in groups. We love to classify it. So the term race had already been floating around since I believe like the 16th century. But it was in the 18th century that we actually see it showing up in like Systema Naturae, which is like Linnaeus's book. So there's actually like 4 racial categorizations that are proposed for humans in that book. So this idea that humans should be categorized into these 4 races that basically are like European, African, Asian, and like I would say Indigenous American. Way different names in that book, and thank God none of them stuck. But like, this idea was already floating around. So when Galton's writing his book, race gets tied to biology because, this biologist made a taxonomic system. And then Galton's writing this book that's saying about eugenics. And of course, you want to like say status relative to what group or better stock relative to what group. So you get this kind of like colonialism gets tied into biology and this whole whirlpool is occurring. And we don't know how like genes are actually inherited. So these kind of misunderstandings about like Mendelian genetics and how inheritance actually works is what allowed like population genetics and its foundations to kind of propagate these racial ideas. And what it ended up doing is basically like making groups that are marginalized now more marginalized, right? Because a lot of it was used to perpetuate this idea that like they would call it the Nordic stock, that the Nordic stock should be superior to all other people. So I think that's like a long-winded way of saying like we had some shaky foundations because of the times, race got tied into biology, even though I wouldn't say that race is a biological thing at all. And basically it gets perpetuated through time.
That's so interesting because I remember learning like about the taxonomic system and Carl Linnaeus,
Yeah.
and you kind of learn about that in a vacuum. You don't learn about any of the context behind that, any of the
Yeah.
other things. That's really interesting, and
Yeah.
um, maybe that's something that should change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You never like the science history is always missing when you learn the science. We just like always through school and like even I would say throughout like college, like not even just primary school or grade school, I always just thought of science in a vacuum. Like this is the science. I never thought about the person doing the science. So it's definitely a good thing.
Yeah. Well, given that very complex history and the past misuses, do you kind of see some safeguards against that kind of things today, or is there like some concerns within the community?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think certainly the community cares and is trying to make changes. So I want to mention like a couple societies that I'm involved in. So the American Society of Human Genetics wrote an entire issue where they actually went through every single one of their like journals and like all the articles in them and looked through time at like how ASHG, the American Society of Human Genetics, has played a role in like perpetuating these eugenic ideas and this ideas of like what I would say are race essentialism, basically saying that there are these biological races that exist, which none of us believe that, and we can get into later, but basically how ASHG played a role in advancing some of these eugenic ideas. So they went through all their articles, they issued an apology, and they showed like the community through time like what has happened. The National Human Genome Research Institute also like has a whole entire page that they've dedicated to like how we need to disavow eugenics and how it has marginalized communities and has perpetuated harm. So those societies are definitely aware of it. This past year at the Genetic Society of America meeting, GSA, which is another one of our big societies, we had a whole panel on eugenics and genetics where we talked about like where has the harm been done? What's the actual history of eugenics? So they're very aware of it. And also, it's the National Academy for Scientists, Engineers, and like Mathematics, NASEM. We being a bunch of population geneticists and epidemiologists actually got together and we wrote about how we should stop using terms like genetic ancestry and we should start using terms like genetic similarity. So I think everybody is trying to make this kind of conscious effort to not make the word population so gray. And I think that's the big reason why a lot of this like racism and these ideas about, race existing is because we've given a lot of ambiguity to the term population rather than making it very clear and concise what we mean. So I feel like a lot of societies are like moving in the right direction. So that's the biggest step is like getting it on a society level. And then as a person, I think like a lot of what we think about is like, if I'm going to do research in a community, do my research goals align with the goals of that community? And are they seeing some sort of like tangible kind of good thing coming out of this research? Maybe it's not like a health study. Maybe you might be interested in like advancing like conservation or like crops. Like crops is a big area of research and restoring native crops. Like making sure your research interests and like that community's research interests are aligned is like another big thing that a lot of people are thinking about too.
That's really interesting. You said there's these kind of societies. Is there like any framework? Or I was also just wondering, like, from the research journals themselves, do they have any like requirements that are maybe trying to like get rid of some of those terms?
Like put safeguards on.
Yeah.
I think the biggest one would be this whole issue from the NASEM, where we try to put up the guardrails of like, we should move away from using terminology like genetic ancestry and start saying stuff like genetic similarity. And also, I think like the other big thing is really on top of that, not using the terms like race and ethnicity and ancestry interchangeably. Those are all very different things. Using the term ancestry in conjunction with like race and ethnicity puts a biological connotation on those two terms. And I would say that race is more of like a socio-political thing that's tied to like status and power. And, you know, ethnicity is more of like a cultural thing, and we often think of religions. So if you add the term genetic ancestry into the mix, it makes it all sound very biological. So I'd say the real like safeguards that people are trying to put up was in this like extremely recent issue, I think 2023, 2024, and guidelines of NASCM. So
Is there any pushback in the field? I mean, is everyone pretty much in a consensus, or is there maybe some people who've been in the field or a little bit older that
that don't agree with this? So when I did this panel on eugenics, I was actually surprised that there wasn't that much pushback against it. It was like refreshing that there wasn't, but there were certainly people out in the audience who were asking questions like, well, if we want to, you know, circumvent all this, you know, kind of eugenics belief, maybe we should focus on, as a society, like identifying all genes that are associated with what people think is race. And that's kind of like nuts, because then that's saying like we believe that race is a biological thing.
Yeah.
A lot of this is coming from people who come out of these labs where the prof is like known to have these kind of like race essentialism kind of beliefs. So you do hear the few voices where you're like, maybe we shouldn't do that because it's actually going against what we want to say. And like, you know, the things that you're suggesting aren't biological. And by, you know, doing this kind of work, this suggests that they are biological. There's also, you know, there's definitely people who are pushing back, but there's also really great scientists who are advocating, like basically revisiting their work that has been used to kind of propagate these ideas of racism, and like writing journal issues about how this is not the case and like what the work really means. So for all the people saying no, there's so many more people saying, no way, we're not going to follow that path. We need to revisit our work and really, really dig into the context.
Oh, that's great to hear. Kind of going forward to the topic of race, I feel like most people that aren't within the realm of population genetics don't have too clear of an idea like what race actually is. As a population geneticist, like how do you think of race? Yeah,
that's a great question. And actually, I wrote down from my ethics class, like what we came up with and what others we had a great guest speaker visit us, like what others have come up with as like what our definition of race is. So we said, you know, race is a socio-political mechanism for classifying individuals, and often it's tied to colonialism, status, and power. So it's completely social. Unfortunately, it has this habit of really overlapping well with geography, which I think is what gets people caught up in this like idea that it's biological. So it has this like unfortunate habit of doing that. But I want to say, depending on where you are in the world, race changes. Like race in the US, those definitions are different than race if you go to Brazil, right? There was also a time where Hindu was listed as a race in the U.S. Census, and it's definitely a religion. And it's not even the religion that's like the majority that every person has. So it's like race evolves through time, even if you look at the U.S. Census. Race changes if you go from the U.S. to another country. Ethnicities also change as well. And those are like more of the classic things where we said like ethnicity is more of a cultural construct. It's often linked to community, religion, language, but it's unfortunately sometimes used interchangeably with race. So I think like those are the kind of ideas that we came up with from this class and from others that people have taught about like what do we think race is versus like, you know, a biological population as we've dictated it. So yeah.
I know with like the census, they change, like those definitions change every 10 years or so whenever they update the questions. And I feel like I've heard people like point to those races and like, oh yeah, these are the races. Like, it's on the census. It's that. It's on like.
It's that, and it's always that. It's not. So there's people who have made like really great infographics that actually can show you through times just in the U.S. since. I think like the 1870s, like how race has changed through time. So you can show that it's like not this immutable thing. It's completely immutable and is like very much dictated by well, in this case, the government, but like the people who are saying what it is. So it's completely social.
Mm-hmm. Um, do you think that there's any kind of like common misconceptions about maybe just like genetics or maybe specifically like genetic differences that reinforces the idea that there's these racial groups?
Yeah, totally. So I think that like I actually wrote down like one of my favorite quotes. So there's this really great population geneticist. His name was Richard Lewington, or Dick Lewington is what people would call him. But basically, you know, he wrote this really critical paper in the early 1970s because he was a very vocal advocate that race is not biological. So if you want to actually show that, you know, how do you do it? So there's some metrics that we use in population genetics that basically allow you to look at genotypes in different populations or and how you've dictated those populations and compare them and ask like what's the kind of differentiation between these groups. And what he found is if you look at any human populations, that basically 86% of the variation in that population, you will see it everywhere else. So the vast majority of variation in our genome, we share with everyone else. And there's only, if you compare any two people, like less than 0.1% of their genome differs between each other. So there's 3 billion base pairs in our genomes. If you pick two people, only like 1 million of them are like differentiating.
I see.
And I will say, like, I just want to continue on this like kind of idea. He also, like, to try and advocate that like race is not biological, he basically tried to look at differences between populations as like classical racial groupings that we would give them. And he found that there's only a 6% differentiation between populations. So the majority of us, we share all of our genome. And like this idea that, you know, there is a biological race is basically useless to us. There's no reason that we can justify there being biological races. This is just like basically what he says is like racial classification is of no social value and it's positively destructive of social and human relations. Since racial classification is of virtually no genetic use because we share the majority of our genome, there's no reason why we can justify continuing using the term race. Mm-hmm. And it's crazy that he said this in the 70s and we're still using terms like race and ethnicity. So I think that was like actually one of the big hook papers for me in population genetics was reading this and like kind of it clicking that like, okay, maybe my thoughts about science and like human populations like aren't exactly where they should be. So yeah.
Gotcha. And I know that there's a little bit of a push for more diverse representation in some of these like they're called GWAS, genome-wide association studies over hundreds of thousands or millions of people. How then should like diversity be represented and why is that important?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, you know, I would say there's certainly a push and like maybe it's been happening for a long time, but I feel like there's a few researchers who have really in like the recent time been going back and looking at all of our like genome-wide association studies, which we often use to like find like say a gene, and we hope it's a gene, find a site in the genome that's like associated with maybe some disease and like trying to learn more about how disease or any sort of trait like maybe hair color or eye color works. Like in the 2000s, people started going back and actually looking at like what are the populations that are majority represented in our data sets. And it turns out they're mostly European. And like, so the diversity push is like, I think once people saw the numbers, it was like, okay, we really need to do something about this. And so there have been pushes to get more data from, first of all, most of the data is also from North America. So getting representation from other countries. So there's a really great group called H3 Africa that's working to make these very large data sets in African populations. There's another really good group called PUMAS that's looking at Latin American countries and getting data about mental health there. There's another great group that's called the SING Consortium that's working a lot with like how do we get indigenous representation in the Americas in like a fair and ethical way. So I think that there's like this big push to change diversity, because if we're doing a bunch of studies on Europeans, though I mentioned like we share the majority of our genome, those like differences that we care to find, maybe we need a very diverse representation of populations to find them. So the other thing that happens is if most of the research is done in Europeans, most of the benefit from the research is actually going to people who have European ancestry. And people have actually demonstrated this by kind of like going into data and saying like, there's this thing that people want to use in the clinic called polygenic risk scores, which are supposed to basically calculate your risk of, say, like getting a heart attack or developing diabetes. Well, if most of the scores are coming from European people, their question was like, well, how well can this predict outcome in like an African American person or a Japanese person or someone else? And they basically found that the accuracy trended with how European you are. So, and it makes sense, like thinking about it from a mathematical perspective, because your training data is European and then you're trying to apply it in another population. So it's not working very well. So that's the other reason why there's been such big pushes, is like, if we want to make genomics equitable and make sure communities aren't further marginalized, we got to make these pushes to have like these very diverse data sets. And I should say that like NHGRI is also trying to do this within the US in a cohort called All of Us. So it's happening. It's just slow.
Do you think like progress overall has like picked up in the last decade, or is it still mainly European white people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it has. And I think one of the reasons why it can pick up is because of the advances in technology. So now like sequencing a genome is way more cost effective than it was before. So that makes it a little bit more accessible. But the other thing that we have to think about is like computing. So US has great infrastructure and places to do computing. If you move outside the US, other countries might not have the same capacity to do the computing that we are, probably because our money is mostly dedicated to the US. So if they don't have funding mechanisms to kind of expand, so we have to think about like, how do we advance our computational methods to be applied here? I think they're getting better, and because the cost is going down, it's getting more accessible. So I would certainly say like, yes, it's happening. I think it's picking up pace. But these studies always take so long too to like actually get data from. So I'm hopeful that things will change. They seem to be moving in the right direction. Okay. Yeah.
And I'm curious. So nowadays, it seems like there's multiple services like 23andMe, Ancestry.com, where you can send in a sample of your DNA and they can like do some magic on it and infer your ancestry or infer a polygenic risk score.
Yeah.
Are they doing the kind of like genotyping that we're talking about in these studies? And how valid do you think these services are? Yeah,
that's a great question. So I would say so these companies are called direct-to-consumer genomics companies, DTC companies. I actually worked at Ancestry as like an intern for a while, so I clearly believed the hype. I do want to say I never have done a test, and I refuse to do a test, so I won't do it. But I think this really goes back to our idea of what is a population. So like you mentioned, you spit in a tube, you send it to them, and then they give you this like map of the world, and they tell you like this is where your ancestry is linked to. So the first thing to note is like these are just it's making like these companies are using reference groups of people that they have deemed a representative population for that region. So once again, this is like however they want to say the population is composed, that's who they're comparing your genome against. So that could mean that your ancestry might change from like 40% from like, let's say Finland, to like they do another round and all of a sudden it's 30%. And you're like, how the heck did that happen? Like, did I just lose like 10% of my ancestry? And it's like, no, you did it. The ancestry stays the same. It's just they pick new people. So it's totally based on like how they're picking people to be representative of these different regions of the world. And so like that's one thing, our kind of murky definition of like what is a population. It's whoever they want to say is there.
It's all arbitrary.
Yeah, it is. It's completely arbitrary. It's just whatever they deem as representative of that region of the world. And you can think about it. There's not great representation in Africa. Mm-hmm. So like could be missing like whole components of ancestry that might actually be coming from there. And the other thing is like thinking about like it's more of genetic similarity to a population, and they just use the term your ancestry comes from here. But the like it's just like you look close to the representative population that they're picking to kind of describe this region. And the other part is like it's just genetically you look the same. But there's totally like, because recombination happens in genomes, you know, way back in the past, you probably share no genetic information with someone who's like on your family tree. So you could be missing these, what we call genealogical ancestors. And you could think of your family genealogy. You may not have like share any genetic material with them anymore. So this is basically Ancestry and 23andMe are telling you like, okay, you know, we picked these people to be representative of this region of the world, and you're genetically similar to these people. And the other thing to like kind of be wary of is they default to a 50% confidence.
What does that mean? Like...
That means they're 50% confidence that your ancestry matches with this region of the world. And I don't think most people realize that
you're flipping a coin.
that the default setting is terrible.
Oh my God.
So if you change it, you'll notice your ancestry composition will change. So it's totally something that it blew my mind when I originally saw it, but they're definitely doing it. And so when you think about it, I guess like interpret with caution. There's a whole article that's out there about a woman named Sigrid Johnson, who basically went to multiple companies and did these ancestry tests and got different results from each one. So they're not even like the same across companies because, like hinting to your first question, they look at different markers in your genome. So sometimes they do totally overlap with different health studies that we want to do. So that's why 23andMe is making this big push to like work with researchers to learn more about these different diseases or traits that we might be interested in. But that panel probably looks completely, or the genotypes that they're looking at and sites of the genome look different than what's going on in Ancestry or like MyHeritage or all these different places. So it's definitely not stable across companies.
There's no like standardized database or reference thing for any of these. It's all proprietary. Is
Yes.
What I'm getting at?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, completely. And I guess one good thing though is like, I think from my kind of read of the data is like most of them have not, or at least 23andMe and Ancestry appear to have never like opened up to allowing law enforcement to search them. Different companies have, and if you like go on to their website and you go post your data on one of those sites where anyone can look at it, they look at that. But seemingly 23andMe and Ancestry have been very close to being used for other
So a little bit of a digression, but wasn't like the Golden State Killer found because like their cousin or something?
Yeah. So this is totally like the big thing that people wonder is, so these big direct to consumer companies, they're giant databases of like millions of people's data. So presumably if law enforcement was interested in finding someone or a culprit of a crime, which is all good and great, they could go to any of these companies and be like, hey, can you find me a family member or relative? And so Ancestry and 23andMe have said, no, we're not doing that. But I think it's like family tree DNA that they search to find the Golden State Killer's like first cousin. So there are some websites out there where law enforcement was using them to kind of do this tracing and finding these. I think they called it like genealogical like hits and stuff like. So there's companies that do this for them that they can hire. So it's pretty crazy.
It's with the hits, it sounds like it's almost like Google, and you're just, instead of putting in search terms, you're just putting in sample DNA and then getting.
And like another great reason to like take our class, our statistical and evolutionary genetics classes, Doc gives this great talk about how he was actually able to make a fake genome and hack these companies. And basically he could make a fake genome for anyone he wanted to and like get a result back. So he could find whoever he wanted. And like he actually set off alarm bells and emailed them like, hey, you know, your database is very hackable and I'll tell you exactly how I did it. And they didn't update it the second time they did. But there's like, he does some really great work showing like, you know, we have to put some kind of like safeguards on these websites because like you are completely findable if someone knows how to do it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
these kind of websites also oftentimes do like polygenic risk scores, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
And then we talked about kind of like why diversity is important. Is this polygenic risk score like a direct area where not having diversity may lead to some like lack of confidence?
Yeah. So like kind of thinking about like applicability of these like polygenic risk scores again. So the answer is like yes. I think that's the answer. And if we really want to understand why, that's really digging into like, at least for me, like the population genetics side of things. So the first thing is like these polygenic risk scores, people hope to port them into the clinic. But if we want to bring them into the clinic, we have to think about like, for example, should you be giving these results to someone if they're not European, right? Like how well is that prediction kind of accuracy, especially if you're going to tell them something about, you know, some disease that maybe has a lot of implications for them and their family. So we should be really confident in these before we just like move them to the clinic and have clinicians giving these results and their patients potentially not getting any background, right? That's like the big thing. It's like, if I don't understand where the score came from, I'm a person who's like, how'd you get that number? But maybe, you know, people aren't always as confident questioning doctors about these things. So like the push for diversity is certainly important in the realm of like computing these polygenic risk scores. We want to make sure that they're interpretable across populations. And what's like even scarier about that question is like, there's already kind of race-based numbers that are being used in medicine. So for example, there's a bunch of news articles, or a handful, I should say, that came out about like kidney dialysis and like, why are so many African-American people on kidney dialysis? Well, it turns out the kind of standard number that we look at to see like how well your kidneys are functioning, it came from a study where they partitioned individuals and it was male individuals is the other thing, as like black or white. And then they said, oh, well, the baseline for white people should be multiplied by 2 for black people, because in our study, it looks like healthy black people have like 2 times the ability to have this like EGFR reading, which is looking at how well your kidneys are filtering. But what that actually meant down the lines is like when someone who is perceived as being African American is presenting in the clinic, they're using a baseline number that's multiplied by 2. So they're getting onto dialysis and needing a kidney transplant when they're already in like dire straits. Whereas if you look at a European person, they were suggested to go on dialysis and get that transplant much sooner because the number looked worse when it should have. So it's kind of all like in this kind of perpetual circle where we're like, yes, we need more representation. And should we be using these numbers in medicine that are based on race? In some cases, I gave you the case where it seems like it's really bad and we shouldn't be doing this. But there are other places where people have advocated like, yeah, we should be adjusting for ethnicity. But the hard part is you're just giving them a self-identified thing. They're not actually looking at your genome. So I'm kind of on the side of like, if we're going to do this stuff, maybe we should port everyone to like genetic similarity and like, you know, sequence everyone's whole genome and then decide what to do.
I mean, that sounds a lot more scientific. Just like sequence everyone's genome, put them into groups, and then use that. Like that sounds much better.
Yeah.
I mean, like even self-identification that can carry with it like so much like lack of confidence, especially if you didn't really know your ancestry and that kind of things.
Yeah.
It's super interesting. I know that like speaking about like just polygenic risk scores.
Yeah.
When people hear genetics, I feel like a lot of times they think of things like Gattaca, where it's like you're selecting different genes, and there's a gene for height, there's a gene for intelligence, and we know maybe that's not quite true. And in fact, it is not true.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea, like how should kind of just the lay viewer think about how genes actually affect the phenotype or the characteristics that we express?
Ooh. Tough question. Another tough question. So I would say like most of the things that we thought were controlled by like, there's this idea of one gene, which is like Mendelian, and then multiple genes, which is polygenic, multiple genes. So a lot of the things that we thought were Mendelian back in the day, turns out that they're not. So like for a while, people were like, hair color is Mendelian. It's not. There's like multiple genes that like control for like whether or not you have red hair or brown hair. Eye color is not. Even the earlobe thing that they used to like have in all my textbooks when I was growing up, that was like whether your earlobe is connected to your ear or not is Mendelian. It's not. So it's actually really hard to find these like Mendelian traits. Most things are controlled by like, and phenotypes that we see are controlled by many genes. So we don't actually know like, you know, if I wanted to ensure that my child was definitely 6 feet tall, so I'm going to like go and look at 15,000 genes that control height to make sure that they're very tall, like what the repercussion could be for some other disease. Because maybe it turns out you change one little thing and it might actually like increase their risk for like a, I don't know, myocardial infarction or like having heart disease. So I think like we as scientists don't even understand fully like what's going on, and there's so many genes that might interact with each other, which is called pleiotropy. Like if we don't understand that, you know, it's hard for us to like really put our confidence in something like a polygenic risk score and say like we should totally be using this in like a Gattaca kind of fashion for like genome editing, because, you know, we just don't actually in people really understand how everything is working. And that's why we make money now. And how we get money is because we want to tell you like, okay, can I figure out like how all these genes work together to do this one function, or, you know, to like maybe even like cut DNA, like how do they make a double-stranded break? Like how is that all working? So like, we don't even understand enough to like say whether Gattaca could actually happen, even though people would like for it to.
Yeah, no, I think I saw a company that it was like, I want to say it was for like IVF, and it advertised like having superior, I think, sperm is what it was, or like donors.
Ooh, yeah.
And it was like, here's a catalog of all of these tall, like, college-educated people that are attractive, and I'm like, does this
work? And no. The answer is no. And I think like the crazy part, and that we talk about a lot actually in my class, is like how IQ, like what is IQ and how has it changed? It's funny because IQ originally was made by this French guy. I'm forgetting his name right now, but he was petitioned by the government to find a metric to help measure the intelligence of elementary school students, purely for the purpose of figuring out like, okay, maybe they're falling behind in some stuff. We should figure out how to like catch them up. And then it got twisted into this thing that's like, how smart are you? And it was really used a lot in eugenics to say like, and even now there's an awful guy who did this study where he made a bunch of people take IQ tests, and literally in languages that they didn't know. So it's like, how am I supposed to take an IQ test in like Korean if I don't speak Korean? But you're giving people IQ tests and telling them to take them in English, and English is not their native language. It's this guy named Richard Lynn. And basically he tried to show that like white people performed the best and like Black people performed the worst. And by Black, he meant people from Africa. But it was like given to people who English was not their native language. So it's like this idea of like, there's another company called Orchid where their whole slogan is like, make healthy babies for their IVF stuff, is like, we can't, like, even if you're in these kind of like big, like risk kind of deciles, they were focused a lot on like height and like schizophrenia and things like this. Most of the people, even in the tails of their like polygenic risk score distribution, they like won't develop schizophrenia. So like we're not even confident in that. So like this whole idea that we can select donors to make this like great group of people and improve people is like crazy to me. Like you could just educate everybody and then we'd all have the same IQ if we had like a great education and people who wanted to help us learn. So it's kind of nuts, like when you start thinking about like how something started versus like how it's going, and you're like, okay, this started as a way to like for us to figure out, and educators to figure out like, okay, my students kind of falling behind in this area, like how can I help them learn? And now it's like, are you smart or not?
Yeah, no, I feel like people still today, like race and before, they think of IQ as like this concrete, like very scientific base thing, but it sounds like it might be more of a social. It's not really a good representative of anything, really.
Yeah, this like intelligence quotient, and actually the quotient part comes from like how it got changed when it hit the U.S. Actually, there's a guy named Louis Terman who translated it from the French version into the U.S. version, and it was like first deployed in the military and at Stanford to like rank people for getting into college and like intelligence. So it's pretty like we get into the weeds of how all of this occurred.
From elementary school to college. That's crazy.
Yeah.
One thing I want to kind of leap back to before is you said personally you would never get your, you would never do like a 23andMe, never do any of that stuff. Do you think that there's like some major privacy issues with, I mean, you talked about how Doc Edge, how he was able to hack the system itself, but do you think that's something that can be like ameliorated or something that can be fixed?
Yeah.
Or do you think inherently that we shouldn't keep databases of people's genetic information?
Yeah, that's yes. I mean, my answer would be yes, only because it's so hard to keep that information private. Like you can become so findable. I think even they showed this in like the human genetics data sets that we have, how findable you can be just through having your genetic data, even when we think we've made it anonymous. And there's actually a really great researcher named Latanya Sweeney who did this thing called the well test. So they do a lot of AI, and I think actually might work with the government at this point. But I think this story came like as they were a graduate student. So as a graduate student, what happened was this guy Weld was, I think, a governor or something. He decided to release all this like social security information, like from like this health group to the general public for people to like, you could buy it for like $10 for all the employees at the university. And he was like, yeah, it's not a big risk. Like they took like your social security number off of it, but like you have all the other like information about their health and their medical records, all this stuff. And he's like, it's fine because, you know, there's no way that you could track me down or anybody in this database. Well, Latanya Sweeney was like, Dr. Sweeney was like, no, you're very findable and I'll show you how. And I think she went and just like got like a Yellow Pages or something, like a Yellow Pages and like a census record and was able to find him because she was like, you know, this is your address that's listed on this social security database. I have your date of birth and like you had the surname. And she was like, there's only one person in this general area with this date of birth. So you can imagine like, you're very findable. And so I feel like with my genetic data, I'm like, absolutely not. I'm never putting it out there because if this ever does become available to other entities, maybe not just researchers, but also to law enforcement, you are just like a much more findable person, even though I don't like plan to do anything criminal. Yeah. I would like to remain in anonymity. And also we have to set up a bunch of things about like, how do we not discriminate against people if we know, like, for example, insurance companies, I'm sure will want to figure out, like, how do we compute a polygenic risk score to make sure that we're not giving insurance to someone who could develop, like, some sort of disorder? Because I have their genetic data now because they just let it out there. And so there's, like, a whole set of, like, privacy laws. I think it's called GINA, where people have, like, tried to go through and say, like, what kind of things might people want to do with this data that are, like, not ethical. And so I feel like I'm never putting my data out there because I'm like, there's certainly like everything, like hindsight, right, is like 2020 and you're like, oh, that was a grave misstep, but you only know it after. So I'm like way too afraid to do it because you're so findable.
I see. And what about like, so what about those GWAS studies that make them a bit more secure or less prone to compared to like the 23andMe databases? Yeah, so people are like, so 23andMe has gotten hacked before and they sent out the emails, so I know they got hacked. We mentioned another company that got hacked as well. You know, hacking just like happens. For these genetic data sets, like the ones that are publicly available, I think people have done a lot of due diligence to make sure these individuals are anonymous to an extent. And also most of them do not have any kind of phenotype information or disease information. So it's just genetic data.
So you don't know on the other end. But with these big biobanks, people want them because they tell you about disease. So originally, you like had to go through a lot of training to get access to the data, and it's kind of like we put people through this training and these kind of ethical, like you're signing a lot of paperwork and saying you've done these kind of ethics trainings, and you feel like the scientists, like out of the goodness of their hearts, will not like send this data to people, but it's downloaded onto your local machine. So should somebody steal that, right? They have full access to everybody's data in there. So what people are trying to do is move into like a more cloud-based space where all the, information and genomes are securely housed, and like you're tracking pins of like who's accessing the data. So I think that's one move that people are trying to make, is like no longer having data that's like downloadable to a local machine and more in the cloud, and hoping like that will add some extra protections. But the other thing is, through time, we do consent, and you have to renew consent. So some people don't renew consent. And if that's the case, if you had the original data, this person doesn't renew their consent, you, as a researcher, are supposed to go back to that data and drop that person out. And I hope that most people are doing that, and I feel like most people would, but they don't necessarily have to if it's on their local machine. But if it's in the cloud, like they just drop it. So I think that's kind of like some measures that people are trying to put on it, is like, how do we make the platform more secure? How do we make housing the data and accessing it more secure so we can track this? And like, how can we like directly manage the data so that like people who are no longer are consenting to having the data used are actually like removed?
Are there like many kind of enforcement mechanisms for this, or like any punishment, like if someone leaks this? Like, for example, like the guy who left or released all that data for $10 without the social security, did he ever face any like?
I don't think so. I hope he wasn't reelected, but I didn't look. He was a governor.
He was a governor.
Yeah, he was like, it's fine, it's good, it's for the good of the world. I don't know what the repercussions would be. I have never looked into like what the actual repercussions would be for that. That's a good question. For now, I feel like basically you just say you did it, and like people hope that you did. I do know that these consortiums like meet pretty regularly to make sure that like as a group, because sometimes these consortiums are actually just like a bunch of people in different groups. I do know that they meet and try to make sure like, okay, how is the data being used and managed, and like try and go through it from the top level. But as users, I'm not quite sure. I do know, at least for like for the All of Us data that just recently came out, we as researchers have to do like 3 hours of training plus to get access to the data. And then actually your level of access is dependent on what your university's security protocols are. So if your university was not doing its due diligence to stay up at the tier it needs to be, they would actually drop you down a tier of access. So it might mean that you no longer have access to the data. So it seems like there's maybe repercussions for the like user if the university isn't staying like current with what they deem as like the top security that you need to access all the data.
Is USC doing its due diligence?
It is. Okay. It is. We are on the top level of access. I can see everything after the trainings. Yeah.
All right. And then final kind of question before we start wrapping up. I know a lot of our viewers love the buzzword AI.
Yes. Yeah.
Is there any kind of ethical considerations that we need to think about with AI, specifically regarding like population genetics? I know that people always talk about like algorithmic bias. Is that something that like really affects the field? Or?
Yeah. So there's a great book called Algorithms of Oppression that's talking about algorithmic bias and like the kind of implications of algorithmic bias and how it's happening. And I think that like we always say this in our classes is like garbage in, garbage out. So if you feed AI like racist data, it will have racist beliefs and biases when you run this. And so I think this has actually popped out in, I think it's called Whisper. It's like a scribe, an AI scribe. And what they found, and Alondra Nelson, who has a really great book called like The Social Life of DNA, and thinking about the implications of like these direct-to-consumer genomics and how it's used in our social lives. But she works with the White House now, and she was like talking about how this scribe, Whisper, basically will just put nonsense words that you, like the person who it's scribing for didn't even say, that are racist. And like and it has biases in it, and it's being fed by like data that we're giving it and training it on. So there's certainly implications like in health sciences for using AI to do things. And I'm like, I know scribing is tough. Like the doctors probably, that's the last thing they want to do. But Whisper is being deployed in a lot of places. So that's like one direct thing where I was like, yeah, that's a little bit concerning. And I think the other thing is like bringing it back to, you were asking a bunch of questions about like polygenic risk scores. So there's a great paper that just came out. I don't think it's fully published yet, might be, but we read preprints now, which is where people put their work out before it's published, where they actually explored, does AI or I think they looked at neural nets actually predict these polygenic risk scores better than our like classic just kind of linear regression. Mm-hmm. And they found that for the most part, no. Okay. Like we are way better off with using the most simple model that we can think of than training some giant neural net to like do this and predict. There was just rare cases where AI outperformed just like the base method, which is a y equals mx plus b. Like that's crazy because people are always like, yeah, we want to do this. And I'm like, it's just a bunch of linear regression. We don't know how it's working. Like, how are the features working? We're unsure. There's very few AI models that are like informed by biology. There actually is one, it's I think called Genie, and it's really great, written by a guy named Lauren Crawford, and worked with Sohini Ramachandran. And this guy's also at Microsoft, which is super cool. So he's a Prophet Brown and at Microsoft. But for the most part, I am so hesitant to deploy AI. And after seeing that paper, I was like vindicated. I was like, I've been telling everybody this, and like it's actually showing. So I think like it's certainly people want to use it in healthcare and medicine, thinking about it with genetics, but I feel like it's just not safe yet. We just don't know. And this is kind of what happens with bioethics too, is like missteps happen and we have to learn from them. And you just hope that the misstep isn't that bad. But it holds true for like thinking about AI and genomics. Like this could go very poorly because if your data is biased, so is your scribe, so is your algorithm. So it's certainly something that we care about and are looking at.
That's very interesting. Y equals mx plus b is outperforms machine learning headline right there.
yeah. It's literally, it's like the crux of that article. I was like, I don't need to read anymore.
To kind of wrap up, do you have any like main takeaways that people should think about, especially with regards to like race and ethnicity and ancestry? I mean, you kind of talked about it before. If you could like summarize the differences between them and whether they mean anything. Yeah.
So I would say the big takeaway is like, okay, one, race is not biology. It is not biological at all. It has no meaning to us biologically. It just has a nasty habit of overlapping geography and in the past being intertwined with biology. But as population geneticists, race is not useful for us. What's more useful is genetic similarity. And I think like instead of saying genetic ancestry, now we want to say genetic similarity. So that's been the big like guardrail for us, is like try to move away from using these terms and try to start saying like, I just want to compare these genetically similar groups, because populations are just so gray and arbitrary. So the big thing is like race, sociopolitical, ethnicity is like more of a cultural kind of thing. They have nothing to do with biology. They're just labels we like to put on things. And your genetics and what matters is just more of like, you know, how genetically similar are you to another group? And oftentimes, you know, most of our diversity is within like our larger human population. It's not between groups.
Gotcha. All right. Well, thank you for joining me today. If you all enjoyed this podcast, I highly recommend taking QBio 115?
Yes,
115. It's a
GEG.
GEG. So if you need a GEG and found today's podcast very enjoyable, I highly recommend taking this class. I had Professor Mooney, and she is an amazing professor.
Thanks.
Alrighty. Now, from Studio A at the USC Annenberg School, this is Wade Boohar, your host for the Paradigm Podcast. You can find us on YouTube and Spotify, and thank you for listening.